It's Charter California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. Glad you're with us today. We are joined by Anthony Rendon. He is a member of the California State Assembly. And I want to speak with you about water. But before we get into the water issues, I want to ask, how did you get involved in this issue? I mean, you represent, I guess, sort of the coast, but how did water become at the top of your agenda?
Well, obviously it's a very important issue,
Yes.
And as the former executive director of the California League of Conservation Voters, which is an environmental organization,
there you have it.
Water is central
Right.
to all that the league does. That being said, in March, when Ben Wesson moved up to the state senate, there was a vacancy in the chairmanship of Water Parks and Wildlife, and the speaker tapped me to fill that position.
And there you have it. Now you are in the midst of the water wars, no doubt.
Right.
I remember well in 2009, Fran Pavley on one side, Tony Strickland on the other, both members of the state senate from left and right, somehow got together,
Right.
and they were able to negotiate a water bond,
Right.
over $11 billion.
Right.
It was called a great bargain, a grand bargain, but it didn't get on the ballot in 2010, didn't get on the ballot in 2012. We're not sure what's going to happen in 2014.
Right.
Where do we stand, sir?
The bond, as it was negotiated, ended up at $11.14 billion.
Right.
It grew significantly in the last few weeks as a result of the negotiations.
Right, back in 09.
Back in 09.
Right. Mm-hmm.
A lot of folks felt that it grew too big because there were a lot of specific earmarks in
Right.
there that weren't necessary. So when I took over Water Parks and Wildlife, the speaker asked me to sort of renegotiate the bond. We thought the best way to do so was to sort of blow it up and start over from scratch.
Weren't there fears that because the bond was so negotiated, every I dotted and T crossed, that somehow, some way, it would just blow up the bond completely?
There was that concern, but at the same time, the bond, at $11.14 billion, there was a tremendous amount of fear that it was simply too
Right.
large. A lot of the polling data,
Right.
particularly the PPIC poll,
Right.
said that a bond between $5 to $7 billion could pass. Anything larger than that wouldn't be able to pass.
So as we speak today, I know you're working with some of your fellow members to try to rejigger the bond.
Sure.
Where do we stand today?
We stand in the assembly. We have a draft of the bond. Let me explain very briefly, if I
Please.
can, the
Yeah.
process through which we went through. When we blew up the bond and started over, we wanted to make sure that we were starting at the most fundamental level.
Okay.
So we began by developing our principles. We wanted to develop principles to tell people sort of the foundation upon which the bond would be based. So, for example, one of our principles, was accountability. We wanted to make sure that every dollar was accounted for. Another principle was to avoid earmarks. We didn't want to have earmarks in the bond because we felt that that's what caused the growth of
Right.
to $11.14 billion. At every step of the way, we had public hearings. We had 5 public hearings throughout the development of the bond. When we left in mid-September, we had a draft of a bond that was at $6.5 billion. And with our bicameral
Right.
legislature, the Senate has negotiated a bond. Has drafted a bond. We've drafted a bond. When we get back in January, February, we're going to sit down with the Senate.
What's their number right now?
Their bond is, I believe, at $6.1 billion.
Oh, so you're close.
Very close.
I noticed that the working group in the assembly, all Democrats.
Right.
And I'm wondering, what was the reasoning behind not including some of your friends on the Republican side?
Yeah, you're correct. The water working group is entirely comprised of Democrats. We did reach out. I met with Brian Dolly, who's one of my Republican colleagues.
From Northern California.
From Northern California. Right. Frank Bigelow, who
also
is
Northern,
also Northern California. He's my vice chair on Water Parks and Wildlife. Minority Leader Connie Conway. So there's been
Who's a hoot.
Who's a fantastic
Right.
person. She's
Yeah.
great.
No,
a lot of
she's
fun.
a lot of fun.
So we chatted. I've had conversations with them about the bond, and we're moving forward. I'm going to go up to Reading, I believe, next month with Mr. Dolly to do a hearing there. So we're including the Republican discussion.
Do you need 2/3 to get the bond onto the ballot? Is that how it works?
Yes, we need 2/3 to get it out of the assembly.
Now, at this stage, does the assembly have 2/3 Democrat? It's a little
we
with
have
special elections.
We have exactly 2/3. We have 54 right now. There'll be a special soon. We'll likely back
What's
to
so
55.
interesting, though, is with water, it's not always Democrat versus Republican.
Right.
It's really North versus South. So
Yes.
I would argue that you can't rely on all 54
You're exactly
Democrats.
right. It's traditionally been North versus South, not Democrat versus Republican. It's becoming increasingly urban, suburban, urban, agricultural. There are a lot of different.
So what's your coalition? Have you found one yet?
Coalition is, well, the bond is I think it's a very well-balanced bond. It's
Right.
$6.5 billion spread out against 5 different categories, ranging from $1.5 billion to $1 billion. So there's money for the Delta. There's money for water storage. So I think, to answer your question, the coalition is built around the sort of flexibility of the bond and the inclusiveness of the bond.
And you do intend to seek out Republican support?
Absolutely.
You mentioned the Delta, and that obviously is one of the most contentious areas when you look at the water wars. We think about peripheral canal of the early 80s, and we think about the fears relating to earthquakes, especially what happened in Louisiana with Hurricane Katrina. It gets complicated, but I know that with the 2009 bond, with your bond, you're looking to, I don't want to say earmark because that's a loaded word, but you're looking to have money spent on the Delta. But in the background, Governor Brown is looking at a completely different plan, $23 billion plan. It's called the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. Could you explain for us the distinctions between the two? I'm confused.
Sure. The governor's plan is essentially a 2-tunnel system that would sort of bring water into the Delta. The governor has said that that is his own plan. He's going to use user fees to pay for that, and he won't involve the legislature in that. Our bond is a water bond that will actually go on the ballot for voters to approve.
Right, but if he was looking to spend $23 billion for this tunnel plan, the query whether does the bond need any money for the Delta? I mean, it seems as if the Delta's being taken care of. No.
No, his plan is strictly about conveyance. It's strictly about bringing water into the Delta. Ours is about ecosystem restoration in the Delta. Ours is about sort of maintaining the structural integrity of some of the levees.
But are you concerned that if you have the governor's plan floating around, $23 billion, even though it's not going to the voters, and then you have this bond floating around, that it could complicate the issue and voters do what they do, they throw up their hands and they just say no?
Right, absolutely. No, we're absolutely concerned about that. We want to, and that's why one of our initial principles was that of accountability. We want to communicate to voters specifically how each dollar is going to be spent and to make sure that it's going to be spent for its intended purposes.
I want to ask you about what's known as climate change. Recently a study came out that said that with 95% surety, humans are responsible for climate change. I'm going to take that at its word, and I'm going to ask you, as a result, given that we do believe climate change is real and that it's a result of human action, what does the bond do to address the question of climate change, if any? Anything?
Yeah, it's a good question. A lot of our runoff has been diminished because of climate change.
Got it.
And with respect to climate change, it's important to keep in mind that the PPIC poll that recently came out, we think of places like Orange County, for example, which is never sort of a hotbed for environmentalism. 59% of respondents in Orange County believe that we need to do something about climate change immediately.
So what does the bond do?
The bond, it includes money for storage to sort of ensure that we capture a lot of the water that is currently sort of flowing out to sea or flowing into the land. There's money for watershed restoration, which again have been tremendously impacted by climate change as well.
And so, as we march forward into 2014, where do we stand? I mean, are we finally going to see the bond on? Would it be? It wouldn't be the June ballot.
November? It would be the November ballot.
Yeah,
it would be the November ballot.
So, should I place odds on it? I mean, is it going to happen finally?
It's definitely a priority it's my number one priority in the early part of the year. The speaker at his final press conference in September said it's one of his priorities.
And do you think the voters are ready? They haven't voted for a water bond, I guess it would be in almost 8 years. You think they're ready?
If it's of the right size, and we're going to keep it within 5 to 7. If it's of the right size and is composed the right way, I think they'll say yes.
His name is Anthony Rendon. He's a member of the California State Assembly. My name is Brad Pomerance. We'll be right back on Charter California Edition. Welcome back to Charter California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. Our guest, Doug Haubert, he's the city prosecutor in Long Beach, an elected position. Actually, you're up for re-election next year.
That's
but
correct.
I want to speak with you about a phenomenon. Candidly, I'd never heard of this phenomenon. What is it called?
Well, in downtown Long Beach, they've had groups of kids show up, and the term that the papers give it is bash mob.
Bash mob.
Bash mob, yeah.
Now, and it's not just Long Beach. It's happening throughout Southern California. This is a new kind of social media event.
Yeah, I would call it a phenomenon, but with social media, you now have the ability to reach 100, 200, 1,000 people instantly and say, let's all meet up at one location.
So that's what a bash mob is. Someone tweets or Facebooks or whatever they do and say, let's meet at wherever, the local mall.
Well, the instigators of the bash mob may be folks that say, let's get together, a bunch of teenagers, let's all get together at the same place at the same time. They get together for the purpose of a handful of instigators to start committing crimes.
Oh, I see.
So under the cover of 200 people, for example, you may see someone start running through a store stealing things, and they do that basically in a large crowd, so it's hard for the law enforcement to catch them.
It's not a flash mob.
No,
it's
no,
not people breaking out in dance.
They're not breaking out in dance. They're breaking something else.
And so 195 kids may have no idea that 5 of them are really there to commit mayhem.
That's absolutely correct. And mayhem's actually a very good word for it because it can quickly digress from something that might be a party atmosphere to something that might resemble a riot. If you will.
So you've seen this in downtown Long Beach, and it can be very scary for store proprietors and often difficult for police to track. I mean, like you said, 200 kids, only 5 are wrongdoers.
Right. Long Beach Police Department is doing a very good job of monitoring social media.
And that's the key.
Yeah, and so they're finding out about them as they're happening or right before they happen, and the police are showing up in response. They're going to the blue line stops where the instigators are saying, let's all meet, or the downtown locations, and then they're following the group, and as soon as they start to break the law, they start to, they arrest the instigators. But unfortunately, you know, there's a whole group there, and so group mentality sometimes takes over.
And it's also hard to tell, I would think, who are the kids that are just there, you know, to have fun, be with a group, and who are the bad doers, the evil doers.
Absolutely, and it creates a dangerous situation for the other kids. So if you just show up thinking, hey, it's going to be a party atmosphere, well, you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know if you're going to be crossing the street at the wrong time next to someone who breaks a window, and you all of a sudden are blamed for it. So it's very dangerous for those that go to it as well.
So if you're a parent watching right now, what would you advise?
Well, you actually raise a good point. Obviously, you have to watch your kids. There's a curfew in Long Beach. If you're under 18, you shouldn't be out after 10 o'clock at night in the downtown area. Know where your kids are at all time. Know who they're with, and know what kind of friends that they're with, and have phone numbers, obviously.
And you also should be monitoring their social media activities.
Absolutely. There's no reason for your child to have a password that you don't also have access to. Now, what we're doing with this bash mob phenomenon is we are contacting the parents and putting them on notice. If their kids are participating in this event, we're telling the parents, if your child comes to the next one, we may be looking at you for contributing to the delinquency of a minor for allowing your child to participate in a bash mob.
And I have to be honest with you, for my friends who follow me on Twitter, on Facebook, I'm on this campaign. It's called Parents Turn Off Your Texts, or turn off their texts, because I see no need for teenagers to have the ability to text each other. It only leads to mayhem in my mind. It's hard to track. Instagram, I mean, all that does is create a sense of exclusion. And so I think in a lot of ways, parents should really consider what they're allowing their kids to do in cyberspace. Because I have to think texting, that's another easy way. You can send a mass text. Why do teenagers need to be able to text? Call, email, they don't need to text.
Well, I think it's good parenting to just know what your child is doing, who they're talking to, and it's just harder to do that now with Twitter, to know who your child is communicating with. So you really have to be more observant than ever before.
So how are the efforts of law enforcement, how are they progressing? Are you seeing some benefits from increased monitoring on social media?
Oh no, absolutely, because the hardest thing to do is to stop one of these bash mobs after it's already in process. So the police are there waiting for the group before they start assemble. Now they have to be very quick, but they're monitoring it 24 hours a day. And as soon as they see one of these bash mobs starting to form, the police monitor it. They go to the location before the group assembles, and they keep an eye on them. Now, so far it's a lawful assembly. It's just a group of kids. But if it gets out of hand and people start breaking the law, the police are there, they're ready for it. And I think that's the big difference. If the police weren't monitoring it, they'd be responding to the incident, and that puts police, puts police in a bad position.
I want to talk generally about kids. I know you recently wrote an article in a publication called School News, which focuses on schools in the Long Beach greater metropolitan area. And the focus was violence. And, you know, bash mobs can be part of this kind of culture of not seeing the negative ramifications of violence. It could be simple schoolyard fights. It could be something that's much more serious. Talk to us about your views on how we as a society, we as Californians, can address the surge in youth violence.
Well, I think you hit on something that's so important and it's often overlooked, and that is that criminal habits begin early. And I believe sometimes it's too late when you address, when a child turns 18, if they've already engaged in a life of crime at the age of 16, 15, 14, it may be too hard to turn them around. So I'm dealing with middle school kids and elementary school kids, and their parents sometimes. Making sure that they're in school on time every single day.
I'm sure you saw that Attorney General Kamala Harris recently issued a report which indicated that truancy is up in elementary schools.
Yes.
And you tell me, I mean, if that's not a predictor of problems later on.
Well, they've done studies that chronic truancy leads to dropout. Being a school dropout puts you in a statistical category that's going to have a hard time making it without committing crimes. Whereas if your child is just going to school consistently, they're going to continue to the next year and the next year and eventually graduate from high school. Now, if they're high school graduates, they're in a statistical category that has a chance to make it. 75% of those in California State Prison right now are school dropouts. So everything we can do to make sure kids are in school on time every day and getting an education is going to pay dividends 5 years and 10 years down the road, because these kids are not going to be committing crimes. They're not going to be incarcerated. Spending a little bit of money now is going to help prevent the criminal activity later.
Well, we've heard that view before, but look, we know we're in an era where there's not necessarily the appetite to spend more money on Head Start or more money on K-5. I mean, I guess in California with Prop 30, we do see increased public school spending, but, you know, it's not easy.
Well, and it's not just more money, it's also wise
Smart
spending.
money, of course.
I mean, using technology and things today, we can make our dollars go a lot further. And I think to some extent, it is a cop-out for some people to say, well, we just don't have the money to do our jobs better. I think everyone in government has to look at what they're doing and say, how can we do the same thing for less money, and how can we do more for less money than we're currently spending? Continuing to do the same thing we're doing now is not going to produce better results in the future.
So what about the question of violence, though? As you said, early intervention. But, you know, once we get into middle and high school, I mean, I even see it. I have a sixth grader, and you can see just the behavior's a little more aggressive. And it could be that, you know, just a lot of hormones are surging and boys are just trying to, you know, pound their chest. But how do you bring that in so it doesn't get to the point where someone gets hurt?
Well, everyone's different, of course. But Long Beach is looking at violence from a systematic point of view right now. We're drafting a violence prevention plan. I'm on the steering committee that's looking at. I think Long Beach did a smart thing by being very inclusive, and it's not just the police and prosecutors, but we're reaching out to community groups and other city departments, Parks and Rec, for example, reaching out to the schools, reaching out to the libraries, and we're looking at what we can do when they're in elementary school to keep them reading, for example.
I'm sure you've heard the cliche. I think it's an idle mind is the devil's play.
Absolutely.
I mean, there's no question that if kids have nothing to do, what happens? They get into trouble.
No, absolutely, but looking at it from a community point of view, what can we all do together? Not just have the police respond after a crime occurs, but who can help the police the most? You know, a few years, 3 years, 4 years ahead of time. The police need to work with these community groups, and the community groups need to work with the police. Sometimes there's a disconnect, and the community groups think that they're helping a problem, when in reality, the police will say, you're missing the problem altogether. Here's the problem,
so
and
you're
here's how
working
you can
to
help
streamline
us.
these community groups, make sure that they are most efficient, most effective.
Well, I hope that's the outcome of the violence prevention plan. It's being drafted. I think if it's a successful plan, it's going to have the police department and public safety at the core of the plan. And then as you get further away from the core, you have other agencies, other government groups and community groups helping the police to do their jobs.
Okay, thank you so much. His name is Doug Haubert, City Prosecutor in Long Beach. When we come back, we're going to speak with an author of a book called The Secession of Mill Valley. Should a city in California secede? We'll see what he thinks. I'm Brad Pomerance. It's California Edition. Welcome back to Charter California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. Our guest is Ray Bourhis. He is the author of this book. It recently came out. It's called Revolt, The Secession of Mill Valley. I have become fascinated by this whole movement of the state of California splitting up, of Texas seceding from the nation. And so when I got this pitch, I thought, I got to have this guy on, because obviously this is fictional, but it really brings up a lot of great issues that are percolating in our nation and our state right now. Talk to me about how you thought of this.
Well, it's just, I guess, the logical conclusion from the set of problems that we're facing.
Right.
And no matter how you look at it, we've got lobbyists that are pretty much writing all the laws now. It's not a government of the people, by the people, or for the people
And
anymore.
one could argue that's been exacerbated by this movement towards term limits.
Absolutely.
Because when folks are not able to become expert on issues because they are artificially removed from office, who's going to be the expert? It's going to be, as you call it, the lobbyists.
That's right. So you got the lobbying problem, you've got the budget deficit issue, you've got divisive issues like gun control, abortion, that have the country pretty much equally divided.
Debt.
You've got corporate corruption left and right. You've got multi-million-dollar campaigns being run for Congress. Hello. The last presidential election, I think, involved over $2 billion.
Right. Mr. Obama was the first presidential candidate to cross the $1 billion threshold.
Unbelievable. I mean, it's really, I don't even know how much $1 billion looks like, or what it looks like. If we had it here on the table.
Literally.
It's a lot of money.
So tell me more about this book and what issues it's brought up and brought out.
Well, my hero in the book, his name is Sean Cogan.
Right, the protagonist, of course.
Right. This started out when he was working for the National Security Agency in Ecuador. What he thought was a campaign to assist foreign governments with American foreign aid. And he learned as a result of that, and that's kind of taken from a book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman.
Right.
What he learned was that the money was staying in New York and the borrowing was taking place in these foreign countries, and these governments could not afford to bail themselves out. They couldn't afford to pay off the loans, and so the U.S. government and a lot of American corporations had that leverage to go down there and drill in rainforests and do all kinds of other things that they otherwise probably wouldn't have been able to do. He got fed up with it. He quit. In my book,
right.
He went back to his home in Mill Valley, California, and he just was disgruntled with the whole political process. He felt alienated. He felt like he didn't have any control anymore. And his friends would say, well, you have to reform things from the inside. And he thought baloney. That was what Ralph Nader was about. That was what Ross Perot was about. They didn't reform anything. So that's not going to work. So he sat around and thought, well, what can I do? I mean, I've got to do something. So he decided to go down to the Mill Valley City Hall and take out a petition for an initiative for Mill Valley to secede from the Union.
It's now, but you
then
laugh,
all hell broke loose.
But you laugh a bit. But here's the thing. I mean, when Mr. Obama was reelected, we saw those types of petitions being filed. We know that recently the county of Secession in Northern California voted to separate from the state of California. Obviously, they can't do that on their own. There are rumors of other counties that want to separate. We've heard about north-south separation of California, east-west separation. Texas has talked about it. You mentioned, I mean, look, does it seem far-fetched? Sure. But it's not as if people aren't thinking it, talking it, feeling it.
Yeah, people are frustrated. They don't know what to do. And that's one of the logical alternatives to what's going on. I mean, West Virginia is separated from Virginia. It's happened.
Right, and as you probably know, right before Pearl Harbor in 1941, the state of Jefferson was on the verge of actually happening, and that was a combination of parts of Northern California and parts of Southern Oregon. Right. And so, I mean, this is not out of the realm of possibility. Although, is it? I mean, really, since you've written this book, what's your sense? I mean, could we see states attempting secession or states breaking apart?
Well, to answer your question, you touched on something earlier that was very interesting to me, and that is, it's not just about the left wanting to do something like this. The right feels exactly the same way. I mean, they're saying budget deficits, socialism,
right.
you know, creeping
Obamacare.
socialism, Obamacare, they
Right.
want out. They want to change things. And when you have the kinds of divisions, look at what's going on with Congress right now.
Right.
I mean, if you were to try to explain this to an ordinary, sensible person, a school child, you know, that Congress would be doing what it's doing, he wouldn't believe it. He'd think this is far-fetched.
And what's remarkable is you look at voting patterns and voting trends. I mean, Democrats live near Democrats, Republicans live near Republicans, and you don't see a lot of close elections if you really dig deep. You know, states are very red, very blue.
Right.
You know, there's some purple states, but not many. I mean, we are no doubt a nation divided. And even in California, you know, there's always been the talk about the state splitting north-south. But if you look at it, the division is not north-south, it's east-west. I mean, look at voting patterns in the state of California. The coast votes very blue, and inland votes fairly red.
That's right.
And so, but where do we go from here? I mean, are we heading down a path in your mind, as the author of this, you know, interesting, kind of intriguing storyline? Are we heading down a path where we are going to break apart, or do you think this is just a hiccup?
Well, you know, I certainly hope we're not going to break apart. I don't know the answer to that question. What the book is largely about is what would happen if somebody actually tried to do this? What would happen to him? And when you take a look at some of the things that have been headlines in the last years, the IRS going after the Tea Party.
And others, apparently.
And others.
Yeah.
And then during the Bush administration, I'm sure the IRS was going against the other side. So you have these bitter divisions, really strong feelings that people have about some of these issues. And as you point out, I mean, with East-West in California, it's pretty much cut and dry. I mean, it's not like a purple situation.
Right.
It's either red or it's blue.
Right.
And there was an interesting, I wish I could remember the details of it, but there was an interesting game, not a game, but a quotation on AOL a couple of years ago. Okay, we'll divide. You get Opryland, we get the Met. You know, on and on. You know, we get Silicon Valley. You know, you get Bogalusa.
Exactly.
And it was that particular satirical comment was unkind to the right. But you can do a flip of that, and you could write one very easily that would go the other way, because I think people are really frustrated.
Why'd you write this book?
Well,
yeah, I mean, you know, you're a successful lawyer. You're a busy guy. What prompted you?
Well, actually, there's several reasons. One is because I have a creative part of me that is being suffocated as a lawyer.
Oh, no. As someone who used to practice law, I hear you.
Yeah.
Be that as it may.
And I love the idea, you know, when I grew up, when I went to law school, you would go to law school if you wanted to change the world. If you want to change the world now, you go into the film business, because you can have a bigger impact on public opinion.
Arguably.
I believe, in that world. So
why
this is part
topic?
of it. The book is going to be a movie.
Well, amen to that. But why this topic? I mean, what is it that compelled you to say, you know, this is something that I feel is real and I want to explore it further?
I think it's just that there's no other possibility. Mathematically, if you look at it, what are you going to do? You can't reform the system. You can't participate in it. You don't have enough. No, never. Money controls the whole thing. Big money controls everything. Billionaires get their telephone calls answered. I do not. And the reality of the situation is that we've got so many people, that so much money is at stake on any legislative issue, either statewide or certainly at the national level.
I want to thank you for joining us. He is the author of this book, The Secession of Mill Valley. I'm Brad Pomerance. Thank you so much for joining us on Charter California Edition.